Hey guys, welcome back, or if you're new here, I'm so glad you found this video. This is Kimberlian's Talk, the place where we dig deep into the lives of some of the most remarkable, shocking, or misunderstood people in history. We talk about figures who changed the world for better or for worse, heroes, villains, and everything in between. Today, we're exploring one of the most chilling and controversial figures ever to emerge from European history, Elizabeth Bathory. Known by many as the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory has been called the most prolific female serial killer in history. According to the legends, she tortured and murdered hundreds of girls and young women, and some even say she bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. But how true are these stories? Was she really the monster described in so many terrifying tales? Or was Elizabeth a victim of a political conspiracy designed to destroy a powerful woman who had too much influence? In this episode, we're going to go deep. We'll examine Elizabeth's family roots and the bloody times she lived in, follow her rise to incredible power, look carefully at the horrific accusations against her, and then peel back the layers of myth to figure out what really happened. So grab a cup of tea, settle in, and let's travel back more than 400 years to find out. How did Elizabeth Bathory become history's most prolific female killer? Before we can really understand Elizabeth Bathory, we need to look at the world she was born into. Elizabeth came into this world in 1560 in Nyírbátor, a town in what was then the Kingdom of Hungary. At that time, Europe was a place of constant conflict, political rivalries, and brutal social systems. Elizabeth's family was one of the most powerful in all of Transylvania. The Bathorys had royal blood, claiming descent from the legendary King Stephen Bathory of Poland, and their influence stretched across the region. Her relatives held titles as princes, military commanders, and high-ranking officials. They owned huge tracts of land, commanded large armies, and had direct influence over the Hungarian king himself. But power came with a price. The Bathory family was infamous for its infighting and scandals. They were involved in harsh, sometimes deadly, political games to secure their status. There are accounts that some of Elizabeth's cousins and uncles were extremely cruel, ordering executions and tortures without hesitation. Elizabeth was born into this environment of absolute power and absolute fear. From a very young age, she saw how punishment was used to keep peasants in line, and how nobility felt entitled to treat lower classes however they wished. Some stories say Elizabeth even witnessed savage beatings or mutilations as a child, shaping her understanding of violence as a tool of authority. Besides this culture of violence, there were also whispers of strange practices in the Bathory line. Rumours spoke of family members involved in witchcraft or devil worship. While these claims are hard to prove, they were part of the legends that would later haunt Elizabeth's reputation. It's also important to remember that Elizabeth was incredibly intelligent. Unlike most women of her day, she was given a first-class education. She learned to read and write in Hungarian, Latin, and German, and even had lessons in Greek. She was skilled in managing estates, bookkeeping, and legal matters. In many ways, she was more capable and knowledgeable than many noblemen of her time. Yet this education also set her apart. A powerful, intelligent woman with lands of her own? In the 16th century, that was threatening to many men, and it would make her an easy target later on. All of these ingredients, wealth, power, violence, and superstition, created a storm around Elizabeth Bathory even before she reached adulthood. It was a world where cruelty was normal, and where powerful women were rare, feared, and sometimes hated. When Elizabeth was 15 years old, her family arranged her marriage to Ferenc Nadasdy, a member of another powerful and influential Hungarian noble family. Ferenc was a soldier by profession, known as the Black Knight of Hungary, because of his ruthless reputation on the battlefield. Their union was less about love and more about politics, strengthening alliances between two of the region's most dominant families. The wedding was one of the most extravagant of its day, with thousands of guests and lavish celebrations. Elizabeth received as a wedding gift Cachtice Castle, an impressive fortress perched on a hilltop in present-day Slovakia, along with large surrounding lands. This castle would eventually become the center of many of the horrifying legends about her. Once married, Elizabeth assumed the role of managing the household and overseeing their estates, especially because Ferenc was almost constantly away fighting wars against the Ottoman Turks. These were brutal, years-long conflicts, and Ferenc was rarely home. That left Elizabeth in charge of a vast network of properties, servants, and local villages. Running such an enormous estate required incredible organisational skill. Elizabeth was expected to handle disputes among peasants, collect taxes, manage crop production, and administer local justice. Under the legal system of the time, nobles were permitted to punish their servants however they saw fit. Some historians believe Elizabeth may have taken this authority to terrifying extremes. While Ferenc was away, Elizabeth developed a reputation for being a strict and demanding mistress. There are accounts that she punished disobedient servants harshly, sometimes whipping them or ordering them to stand outside in freezing weather. At the time, this was not considered unusual for nobility, but Elizabeth's punishments may have been far more severe than what was typical. It's worth noting that Ferenc himself was no gentle figure. He was said to have taught Elizabeth torture techniques that he had learned in the army. Some sources suggest he even helped her experiment with cruel punishments on their servants, as a way of entertaining himself during brief returns from war. By the time Elizabeth was in her 20s, she was essentially running a small kingdom on her own. She was powerful, respected, feared, and even admired for her intelligence and business sense. But under the surface, rumours were already starting to spread. Stories of missing servant girls, strange injuries, and even deaths began to circulate around the region. People in the villages were afraid to speak against a noblewoman as powerful as Elizabeth. After all, who would believe a poor peasant girl's family over one of the richest families in Hungary? And so, for years, these rumours were only whispered in secret. After Ferenc's death in 1604, Elizabeth was left a widow at the age of 44. That gave her absolute control over her vast estates and wealth. With no husband to share her power, Elizabeth's influence only grew. But so did the rumours. Peasant girls continued to disappear after being hired to work in Elizabeth's household. Some parents were desperate to place their daughters in service at Cachtice Castle because working for a noble family meant a better life. But those daughters often never returned. Witnesses started to talk. They whispered about strange screams coming from the castle walls, young girls being carried out at night, lifeless and pale. People said Elizabeth had a team of loyal servants who helped her lure, torture, and dispose of her victims. Some claimed that Elizabeth beat girls until they died from their injuries. Others told even more disturbing tales. Girls burned with hot irons, stabbed with needles, or forced to stand naked in the snow before being doused with water until they froze to death. These rumours were horrifying, but what made them even more terrifying was Elizabeth's social status. She was a noblewoman with powerful relatives, protected by the law, and no one dared accuse her directly. Even if a family suspected something had happened to their daughter, they were too terrified to challenge the Countess. In some versions of the legend, Elizabeth's cruelty escalated to the point of obsession. She was said to personally enjoy inflicting pain, laughing as the girls screamed. Some claimed she bit chunks of flesh from their shoulders or faces. Over time, the legend grew to include blood drinking and bathing in the blood of virgins to keep her skin youthful, a truly nightmarish image that still captures people's imaginations today. However, it's important to pause here and consider the historical evidence. Most of these stories came from testimonies given many years later, sometimes under torture themselves. There is no proof Elizabeth ever actually bathed in blood, but this myth became one of the strongest parts of her legacy. Still, even if the blood bathing was an invention, the scale of the disappearances was real enough to spark official suspicion. So many young girls had vanished under Elizabeth's control that eventually, even the powerful men around her could no longer ignore the rumours. By 1610, King Matthias II and the Hungarian authorities decided it was time to investigate. Elizabeth's enemies saw a perfect opportunity. If she was guilty, they could finally remove a powerful, wealthy, and independent woman who stood in their way. If she was innocent, they could still damage her reputation beyond repair. Either way, Elizabeth was about to face a reckoning. By 1610, the rumours about Elizabeth Bathory had grown too large and too gruesome for the authorities to ignore. King Matthias II ordered György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the king's second-in-command, to investigate. Thurzo was not just any investigator. He was also a powerful nobleman with personal ties to Elizabeth's family. His job was delicate: uncover the truth, but avoid a scandal that might destabilise the already fragile Hungarian nobility. After gathering months of testimony, Thurzo planned a raid on Elizabeth's castle. On December 30th, 1610, he and his men arrived at Cachtice Castle without warning. What they found would become the core of Elizabeth's terrifying legend. According to Thurzo's report, Elizabeth was caught in the act of torturing young girls. He described a scene of absolute horror: bodies of dead and dying girls lying around, fresh wounds on their flesh, chains, blood, and instruments of torture scattered across the castle. Witnesses claimed that Elizabeth had personally overseen the brutal treatment of these girls. Thurzo arrested Elizabeth on the spot, along with 4 of her closest servants, Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Katerina Benica, and Janos Uvari. These servants were accused of helping Elizabeth find victims, restrain them, and carry out her orders. Over the following weeks, more than 300 witnesses were brought forward to testify. Some were peasants, others minor nobles, and many were former servants who had survived Elizabeth's household. They told stories of beatings, stabbings, mutilations, and unthinkable cruelty. Some witnesses even claimed to have seen Elizabeth herself biting her victims and laughing while they screamed. Others described seeing blood being collected in bowls, fueling the myth of blood bathing. But we should remember that many of these testimonies were gathered under torture or extreme pressure. Historians today argue that at least part of what these witnesses said may have been exaggerated or even fabricated, in a desperate attempt to please the investigators or save their own lives. Still, there was no denying the enormous number of missing girls. Even if only a fraction of the accusations were true, Elizabeth's crimes would have been shocking for any era, but especially for a woman of such high social rank. The question of what to do with Elizabeth was politically complicated. Putting a high-born noblewoman on trial would shake the power structure of Hungary and might even spark rebellion among her allies. In the end, a compromise was reached. Elizabeth would be kept under strict house arrest for the rest of her life. Her 4 servants, however, were not so lucky. They were tried, found guilty, and executed in public, accused of carrying out the most horrific parts of Elizabeth's orders. Their confessions, many obtained under torture, would cement Elizabeth's reputation as one of the most sadistic killers in European history. Elizabeth herself was never officially convicted in a courtroom, but her punishment was severe. She was walled up in a set of rooms inside Cachtice Castle, with only a tiny slit to pass food through. There, she would spend the final 4 years of her life in total isolation. Elizabeth's punishment, while less public than execution, was still a devastating fall from power. Imprisoned within her own castle walls, she was sealed inside a suite of rooms with only a small opening left for food and air. Historians describe this as a sort of living tomb, a prison designed to erase her from society without risking the scandal of a public trial. Imagine this: a woman who had commanded hundreds of servants, vast lands, and enormous wealth, reduced to sitting alone in a dark room with no visitors, no communication, and no comfort apart from the occasional servant delivering her food. Her empire was gone, her allies had abandoned her, and her reputation was in ruins. During her captivity, Elizabeth kept a small writing kit, and it's believed she wrote letters to family members pleading for mercy or a review of her case. But those letters never changed her fate. Once the authorities had decided she was too dangerous to free, there was no hope of release. The villagers around Cachtice Castle, meanwhile, continued to whisper stories about Elizabeth. They told tales of ghosts wandering the castle halls, of strange sounds at night, of curses falling on the land. Elizabeth's legend was growing even as she sat behind stone walls. After about 4 years in this confined isolation, Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21st, 1614, at the age of 54. Some accounts say she simply lay down one night and never woke up. Others claim her jailers found her in a state of delirium after refusing to eat for days. Her burial was almost as mysterious as her life. Local records suggest she was buried in the church of Cachtice, but later her body was moved, possibly to her family's ancestral lands, because villagers didn't want her remains in their town. Even in death, Elizabeth Bathory inspired fear and disgust. Her name became a warning. Parents used it to frighten their children into obedience, and nobles told stories about her as a symbol of what happens when a powerful woman steps beyond the bounds of social acceptability. But her story was far from over, because over the centuries, the myth surrounding Elizabeth Bathory would only grow stronger, transforming her from a powerful Hungarian countess into the near-supernatural Blood Countess, whose legend still haunts the world today. After Elizabeth's death, stories about her cruelty spread like wildfire. Over time, they became more exaggerated, blending real accusations with folklore until it was impossible to tell where fact ended and fantasy began. One of the most famous and disturbing elements of the legend is that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins to maintain her youth and beauty. This gruesome detail first appeared many decades after her death, added by storytellers eager to shock their audiences. Historians today generally agree there is no contemporary evidence she ever actually did this, but the myth was too sensational to ignore. Why did people believe it so easily? Because the idea of a powerful, rich woman committing unspeakable acts fit perfectly into the fears and prejudices of the era. People were quick to assume that a woman who held so much wealth and authority must have been corrupted by the devil or by unnatural desires. There were also practical political reasons to amplify the horror stories. Elizabeth's lands were incredibly valuable. Once she was removed from power, those lands were seized and redistributed among other noble families and the crown itself. The worse her reputation, the less chance her children or distant relatives would ever reclaim their inheritance. Church officials, eager to maintain control and moral authority, likely encouraged these tales to keep the people fearful of noble excess and to show that even the most powerful could be brought low. Over time, poets, writers, and local storytellers added more and more chilling details: iron maidens, demonic rituals, blood-drinking ceremonies, and even cannibalism. It's important to remember that Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries was a place where witchcraft trials were common. Women accused of being witches were regularly tortured, executed, and demonized in folklore. Elizabeth Bathory, as a powerful and feared noblewoman, became the perfect canvas for those anxieties. While there is little doubt she was responsible for the deaths of many young women, whether through neglect, brutality, or sadism, it's almost certain that the most grotesque parts of her story were created after the fact. They served as cautionary tales, a warning about the dangers of pride, cruelty, and female ambition. In modern times, historians and writers have tried to separate the real Elizabeth from the monstrous legend. Some argue she was a sadistic killer who got away with horrific crimes for years. Others believe she was framed by her rivals. In truth, the story is likely a tragic mix. A ruthless, powerful woman who abused her authority, surrounded by enemies eager to destroy her, all in a time where violence and fear ruled society. Elizabeth Bathory's legend didn't fade away with her death. It grew even more powerful in the centuries that followed. In fact, she became one of the most enduring figures of Gothic horror, inspiring countless books, plays, movies, and even video games. Writers in the 18th and 19th centuries loved her story, turning Elizabeth into a kind of female Dracula. These authors mixed folklore, superstition, and fragments of truth to build the terrifying myth of the Blood Countess. Just like Bram Stoker's Dracula, she was portrayed as an almost supernatural monster who fed on the blood of innocents to keep herself young and beautiful. In modern times, horror movies have repeatedly revisited her tale. Films like Bathory, 2008, tried to show a more balanced view, while others leaned into the bloodbath legends, depicting Elizabeth as a crazed, vampire-like killer. Her story has also appeared in video games. For example, the Castlevania series uses elements of her legend, and role-playing games often draw on her myth as inspiration for evil Countess characters. In heavy metal music, bands have dedicated entire albums to her bloody legacy, celebrating her as a symbol of the macabre. Why does she still fascinate us so much? Partly, it's the shock value. A noble woman torturing and murdering girls on such a massive scale is horrifying even by modern standards. But it's also because Elizabeth represents something deeper: the fear of powerful women who refuse to be controlled, and the suspicion that their power must come from something evil or unnatural. In psychology and literature, this is called the monstrous feminine, the idea that a woman who steps outside traditional roles becomes terrifying. Elizabeth Bathory is perhaps the ultimate example. Her name still pops up in documentaries and history channels whenever there's a discussion of female serial killers. And even centuries later, local legends around Cachtice Castle remain strong, with ghost stories about Elizabeth's tortured victims haunting the ruins to this day. This combination of historical cruelty, supernatural horror, and female power ensures that Elizabeth Bathory's story will keep inspiring dark tales for generations to come. Elizabeth Bathory's story is more than just a horrifying piece of folklore. It tells us a lot about the world she lived in, and maybe about human nature itself. First, it highlights how power can corrupt absolutely. Elizabeth had enormous wealth, a noble title, and near total authority over the people around her. In an age when the nobility saw peasants as little more than property, cruelty could thrive unchecked. When no one dares question you, there is almost no limit to what you might get away with. Second, her story shows how dangerous rumours and political rivalries could be. Elizabeth's enemies saw an opportunity to bring her down, and whether the bloodiest parts of the legend were true or not, they used them to destroy her. In those days, reputation was everything. Once Elizabeth was branded a monster, she had no hope of defending herself. Third, it reminds us how gender shaped medieval society. A powerful, independent woman managing vast estates without a husband was rare and threatening. It was easy for men in power to believe, or at least pretend to believe, that a woman like that could only maintain control through witchcraft or satanic practices. Elizabeth became the perfect scapegoat for every fear society had about female independence. Her legacy is also a window into the birth of modern horror storytelling. The same ideas that made Elizabeth seem monstrous in the 17th century, blood rituals, sadism, vampirism, are still alive in horror movies and novels today. We can trace a direct line from her legend to our modern fascination with serial killers, vampires, and supernatural evil. In some ways, Elizabeth Bathory's story is a tragic cautionary tale. Whether she was a mass murderer, a victim of a political plot, or some combination of both, her fate shows how unchecked power, social prejudice, and fear can blend into one of the darkest legends in human history. So after all this, what do you think about Elizabeth Bathory? Was she truly the Blood Countess, a sadistic killer who murdered dozens, maybe even hundreds of innocent girls? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by her rivals, turned into a monster by centuries of rumour and fear? Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories, your questions, and even your own research about Elizabeth Bathory. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most chilling figures, please hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and reach more curious minds like yours. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to Kimberlian's Talk for more videos about the most impactful, controversial, and fascinating people who shaped our world, for better or worse. We explore heroes, villains, mysteries, and forgotten stories that deserve to be told, and your support helps keep these stories alive. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. I really appreciate you being here. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.